After 10 years of explaining Star Wars online, I've come across the same questions again and again. Today I'm answering 40 of the most frequently asked questions I've seen about Rogue One.
You have to start somewhere.
Why does Director Krennic have a special shuttle, a cape on his uniform, or a military rank at all when he's a science officer? The answer to all those questions is that he has delusions of grandeur and a desire for more power, like most Imperial officers do. He thinks his status as director of the development of the Death Star makes him super special and wants everyone to know it. So he demanded a cape be attached to his uniform, he chose to use a Delta-class shuttle instead of the standard Lambda-class just so he would stand out more, and he negotiated a military rank he could use to lord over subordinates. All of it stems from his sense of self-importance, which is of course eventually stripped from him by Grand Moff Tarkin, and it's pretty rich of him to claim the Death Star was his achievement when he couldn't finish it without Galen Ersos. Why do Death Troopers sound garbled when they talk? They had their own special encryption to use on missions, ensuring enemies or even allies would be unable to understand what they said to one another. They would speak normally through their helmets, it would be transmitted as encrypted audio, and then other Death Trooper helmets would decrypt the communication back into BASIC. The sinister sounds also added to their intimidating presence and helped build up the legends surrounding the terrifying troopers, including a rumored link to an Imperial initiative to create zombies. While we only hear Death Troopers speak with the encryption active in Rogue One, Star Wars Rebels showed us that it could be turned off for regular communication in BASIC.
My child.
What were Saw Gerreras' origins? He's become more and more prominent in Star Wars since his appearance in Rogue One, but his debut was in the Clone Wars Season 5 during the Onderon arc. Saw was a freedom fighter that fought against the Separatist invasion of his home. Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ahsoka Tano, and a group of clone troopers traveled to his world to help train Saw's soldiers in guerrilla warfare. During their campaign, Saw's sister and moral compass was killed, a death that pushed him towards extremism. After the rise of the Galactic Empire, Gerrera shifted to combat another occupation, and his following grew and grew until he was leading his own rebel cell. The tactics he learned from Anakin Skywalker were used against the Empire for years as he launched terrorist attacks that often resulted in civilian collateral damage and loss of life. When did the stone statue of the Jedi on Jedha fall? It was hundreds of years earlier during the High Republic era, as told in the audio drama The Battle of Jedha. There were once 4 statues on the moon, but over the years, 3 of them had fallen until one remained, dubbed the Final Protector. Nearly 400 years before the events of Rogue One, a peace summit was held on Jedha that was sabotaged, causing a riot in the streets, war in the skies, and general anger towards the Jedi Order. A group of civilians gathered to pull the massive statue down, having been manipulated by an anti-Jedi cult called the Path of the Open Hand. Their true goal in the chaos of the battle was to reach a hidden vault underneath the Final Protector, which held a relic that would help them in their fight against the Jedi Order.
Would you like to know the probability of her using it against you?
How did Cassian meet K2SO? This answer might seem obvious if you watched Andor Season 2. K2 chased Cassian during the Gorman Massacre until a speeder crashed into him and he powered down. The pieces of the droid were taken back to Yavin, where he was rebuilt and reprogrammed. That's all well and good, except the droid's origins were first told in a 2017 comic called Cassian and K2SO. In it, Cassian meets the KX droid on a mission to the planet Wakeko and reprograms K2 as part of his escape. The events of Andor are completely different, so is there a way to reconcile that? My favorite headcanon that I saw on Reddit was to suggest that the comic is now a cover story used by the Rebellion. General Draven tells Cassian his presence on Gorman and rescue of Mon Mothma will not be logged. If it's not on the record and they need a new cover story for how they got a hold of an Imperial droid, the comic can serve that purpose.
Lies!
What is wrong with Saw Gerrera? A lot? He is filled with paranoia, and honestly, it's understandable. I'd be paranoid too if I saw the way Luthen Rael operated and treated his network of rebels like pieces on a chess or Dedrick board, but I'm gonna focus on his physical ailments. Saw is meant to be a mirror of Darth Vader in many ways. His extremism and militancy has taken a physical and mental toll on his body over the years, having lost both of his legs, becoming more and more machine, and even developing breathing issues. His lung problems come from his time personally investigating the Empire's activities on Geonosis. The Death Star began construction above that world until it was moved to Scarif. When the time came, the Empire exterminated the Geonosian people, basically with pesticide to keep their secrets safe. Saw traveled to Geonosis and was briefly trapped there, breathing in the toxic fumes, eventually causing his need for a respirator. At least, that was the original explanation, but Andor has now shown us that Saw enjoyed breathing in rhydonium for fun, which he knew would do internal damage. So he either needs oxygen to help him breathe, or he is just continuing to pump himself full of explosive gas. I think we can chalk up his breathing issues to both the rhydonium and the Geonosian pesticide. How long did it take to build the Death Star? About 20 years. As we can see at the end of Revenge of the Sith, the superweapon was well underway. It began construction above Geonosis about 1 year before the end of the Clone Wars, or 20 years before the events of Rogue One, so it took 2 decades, but it should not have taken that long. The construction itself wasn't the issue. The space station had likely been completed for several years. It was the development of the super laser that actually took the longest amount of time. It was Galen Ersos' task to develop the super laser under the belief he was creating some form of sustainable energy, not a planet killer. When he learned the truth, he went into hiding, stalling the super laser's creation for 4 years. Even when Erso was forced to return, it took him 13 more years to finish the work, stalling as much as he possibly could.
I'll always protect you.
What happened when Galen Erso was part of the Empire? The brilliant scientist was brought into the Empire under the false understanding that he was working to create a source of unlimited energy using Kyber crystals. Called Project Celestial Power, Galen was excited to help rebuild the galaxy after the destruction caused by the Clone Wars. Director Krennic kept the Erso family busy and detached from Galen, causing him to slowly fall further under the control and rhetoric of the Empire, but his wife, Lyra, eventually convinced him of her own suspicions that his research was being used for something sinister. After 2 years of working alongside Krennic, Galen discovered the truth that his work was being used to create a super laser, and so they fled the Empire and hid on the planet Lamu.
Kyber crystal. All they can get.
Why does Jedha have so many Kyber crystals? This is a bit of world building that comes from an interview with director Gareth Edwards. I don't believe it's been confirmed in any actual story material, but I still think it's interesting. Edwards said they designed Jedha's holy city to resemble a meteor impact. In his mind, Jedha was struck by a Kyber-rich meteor thousands of years ago. The living crystal then grew and spread veins across the world, centralizing around what would become known as the holy city, where many Force-based faiths would make pilgrimages. The Temple of the Kyber was established there, as well as Kyber mines and Kyber mirrors held under the Dome of Deliverance. What was inside the Temple of the Kyber? We don't get to see its interior in Rogue One, but several comics have shown us what was held within that spire, and it's pretty much what you would guess, a bunch of Kyber crystals and Kyber artifacts. There were tunnels beneath the temple where Kyber grew, and over 2,000 statues that had been carved out of Kyber. One of them was actually a Jedi artifact said to have been carved by a lightsaber. I take this to mean that the Jedi trusted the Guardians of the Wills with their own history, suggesting a strong level of trust between the two groups. This also tells us that the Empire ransacked not only raw Kyber crystal from the temple, but thousands of historical works of art, all to be broken down to power a planet-killing super laser.
Borg Gollet will know the truth.
Who or what is Borg Gollet? He was a boar of the Myron, a species that was first created for Star Wars Legends. As Saw Gerreras states, Borg Gollet could read minds, and the Rogue One novelization gives us more insight into what that looks like for Bodhi Rook. During the process, Borg Gollet had to sift through the pilot's mind and memories, basically mixing up Bodhi's entire life, so for a time he didn't know where or when he even was. Saw's partisans weren't the only groups to use Myrans as interrogators. The Empire, and specifically the Imperial Security Bureau, were also known to use them to read the minds of their prisoners. It would appear that Boar is a title of some sort, so Gollet might be Borg Gollet's actual name, and Boar might refer to Myrans that could read minds. Maybe they couldn't all do it, that's unclear right now.
Hey, you just watch yourself.
What were Pondaba and Dr Evon doing on Jedha in Rogue One? Evon was a cosmetic surgeon gone mad that performed horrific experiments on his victims, and we can see some of his victims on Jedha. A cyborg named Cassian was blown apart in a terrorist attack, likely by Saw Gerrera, and Evon pieced him back together. The Mad Doctor was also responsible for the creation of a group called the Decraniated. They were also wounded civilians from the fighting on Jedha that Evon used to remove their minds and free will, making them cyborg slaves. We can briefly see them in Rogue One and Solo. A lawman named Tam Posla can be seen on Jedha hunting for Evon, and his presence likely caused him and his associate Pondaba to flee to Tatooine.
I'm Chirrut Inwit.
Who were the Guardians of the Whills? They were founded at least 500 years prior to Rogue One, and I would expect they are much older than that. They were a religious order of warrior monks similar to, but separated from the Jedi. They believed in the Force and entrusted it to protect and guide them, but they did not have the same level of control over the Force as a Jedi. In fact, one member of the Guardians felt that the Force should not be used at all, and started a cult called the Path of the Open Hand, which stated that the Force should be freed. Their primary job was the protection of the Temple of the Kyber and the people who would visit it. When the Empire occupied the city, the Guardians of the Whills were driven out of the temple, feeling lost and without purpose.
The strongest stars have hearts of Kyber.
Did stars really have hearts of Kyber? I'm not sure right now. I would lean towards saying no, but we're in a space fantasy situation, so it's possible that's how stars are created in the galaxy far, far away. Or maybe it's just one way stars can be formed. The destruction of Starkiller Base formed a new star, and that superweapon was once one of the most Kyber-rich planets in the galaxy. I also want to point out a story called Blood Moon from the book Dark Legends, which is not canon, but does play with the idea of stars having hearts of Kyber. In that story, we see a star whose Kyber heart had been cracked, causing solar flares that would drive people on a nearby moon insane. It's basically a take on a werewolf legend in Star Wars, following a Shistavenin that loses himself to the effects of the injured star.
For all this, as the Force wills it.
Could Chirrut use the Force? No, I would not consider him to be Force-sensitive in the traditional sense, despite his astounding combat abilities. I don't believe he could wield the Force the way a Jedi could, but he obviously believed in it and trusted it to keep him safe, or at least to guide him to fulfill the will of the Cosmic Force. As for his fighting style, Chirrut honed his senses through a martial art called Zamashiwo. His staff also gave him some advantages and potential connections to the Force. It was made of Uneti wood, the same kind of Force-sensitive tree that once stood in the Jedi Temple and also served as the Jedi Library on Ahch-To. Its cap contained a sliver of Kyber crystal, and there was a battery-powered lamp that provided a slight hum for Chirrut to hear, giving him a better sense of control over the weapon. Based on what we know about Chirrut, I do think he can feel the Force, like he can see it moving darkly around Cassian, and there's gotta be something that allows him to dodge blaster bolts or one-shot TIE fighters out of the sky. Basically, I think he allows the Force to control him, but he has no control over the Force. How did a crashed Xwing wind up in the middle of Jedha's holy city? Its black and white coloring gives us a clue because it matches the Xwing seen later used by Saw Gerreras' partisans. The book Guardians of the Whills tells us of the battle between their squadron, the Cavern Angels, and Imperial TIE fighters. When the Star Destroyer Dauntless arrived to settle over the Holy City, Saw's pilots fought against it. Of course the attack was fruitless. 3 of Saw's 8 X-Wings were shot down, and one of them landed in the city itself near the Path of Judgments, destroying a home and killing one of its occupants.
This is a first for me.
Why does Cassian say he's never been in prison before when we know he was in Andor Season 1? Obviously, Rogue One came out before Andor, blah blah blah, but for an in-universe answer, I could think of several rationalizations. The actual exchange of lines is Chirrut saying, "We've been in worse cages than this," and Cassian responding, "This is a first for me." That could now be read as sarcasm, or he could mean he's never been locked up by other rebels before, or he could just be straight up lying. He doesn't know Chirrut, he's just exchanging banter. Not every line a character says should be understood as concrete truth.
Are we not still friends?
What was Jyn's life with Saw like? Jyn was taken in by Saw at the age of 8 and was raised by him for 8 years. Living among the partisans, she was trained in the use of blasters, melee weapons, and hand-to-hand combat. She was brought on missions more and more as she became a teenager and witnessed the brutal slaughter of innocent civilians, all to assassinate their planet's new Imperial governor. On a mission to the planet Tamsi Prime, the partisans were betrayed by one of their allies, who had begun suspecting Jyn's connection to Galen Erso. Saw provided his ward with a blaster and told her to hide in a bunker. She thought Saw would return, but instead he left her behind, partially to keep her safe from his own people.
We call it the Death Star.
What exactly was Galen Erso's sabotage on the Death Star? I've seen the misconception that he was responsible for the thermal exhaust port on the Death Star, which is not the case. As he says in the movie, he placed a trap in the reactor, making it and the entire superweapon vulnerable to a single explosion. If it weren't for Galen, Luke's impossible shot in the Battle of Yavin wouldn't have mattered. The proton torpedoes would have traveled down the exhaust port, exploded, and then nothing else would have happened. But Erso planted a flaw that allowed that explosion to ignite and destroy the entire station. Again, as he states in the movie, the structure plans for the Death Star were necessary for the Rebel Alliance to find a way to reach the reactor and cause that explosion, and the thermal exhaust port was their best option.
Save the dream!
What were Saw Gerreras' final thoughts? The Rogue One comic adaptation by Jody Houser added a single great line for Gerrera, Steela, the name of his sister back when they fought together on Onderon during the Clone Wars. Saw was always the more militant sibling, fighting against the droid army that invaded their world. Steela was more noble and an excellent leader, but during one of their battles, Saw damaged a droid gunship that inadvertently led to Steela's death, leaving him consumed with grief and without his moral compass. He sought revenge against the Empire at any cost, which led to pain and suffering for countless civilians and at times even his own allies. Did any members of Saw Gerreras' partisan survive? Yes, some of them, including Benthic Two-Tubes, actually returned to the ashes of Jedha shortly after the destruction of the Holy City. Others traveled to the planet Geozen, where they recovered and reorganized into a group they called the Dreamers. They were led by a man named Lux Bonteri, who was an ally of Saw's during the Clone Wars. Unfortunately, the group was short-lived. They were infiltrated and eliminated by an Imperial Special Forces group called Inferno Squad, although the ultimate fate of Lux Bonteri is still unknown.
I haven't completed my calculations.
I'll make them for you.
How does Cassian jump to hyperspace within Jedha's gravity well? Ships equipped with hyperdrives are normally prevented from jumping to hyperspace or will be pulled out of hyperspace if they encounter a gravity well like a planet or a star or an artificial well like the ones created by Imperial interdictor cruisers. It's a safety measure, but one that can be turned off or ignored in moments of desperation. K2SO points out that they had made some calculations that weren't complete, and Cassian simply pulls the trigger. It was a dangerous gamble because they very possibly could have flown right into a star or something, but if they had stayed on Jedha, they would have died for sure.
Oh, it's beautiful.
What happened to Jedha after the events of Rogue One? Nothing good. Even though the moon wasn't completely destroyed, its crust broke apart, but it was shockingly still somewhat habitable. Many religious groups remain there, as well as some surviving members of Saw Gerreras' partisans. After the destruction of the Death Star, the Empire returned as well, planning to once again harvest as many Kyber crystals as they could for the second version of the superweapon. Luke Skywalker and his friends helped defend the moon against the Empire, but it was known that Jedha was a slowly dying lost cause. By the time of the Battle of Endor, Luke noted that there was nothing left of the Holy Moon.
I've been in this fight since I was 6 years old.
Has Cassian really been fighting the Empire since he was 6 years old? Andor Season 1 shows us Cassian at an older age, stranded on the planet Kenari during the time of the Republic, and then we see that he wants nothing to do with the fight against the Empire until he's in his late 20s. We don't know the full story of his childhood right now, but I expect what Cassian means in Rogue One is that he has been fighting oppression and planetary abuse since he was very young, even if he didn't understand it. No, he doesn't tell Jyn there was a long stretch of time where he avoided the conflict because it's an emotional moment when he's in an argument. He's not writing his Wikipedia article. Andor Season 2 could clear this up more. I'm definitely hoping we get answers to questions surrounding his origins on Kenari. When did Darth Vader build his fortress on Mustafar? About 12 years before the events of Rogue One and A New Hope. After Revenge of the Sith, Vader was headquartered on Coruscant with his master, Emperor Palpatine. He hunted Jedi survivors for that duration, but there weren't many left to find, so his rage turned towards his own underlings, the Inquisitors. He deemed 2 of them traitors and chased them through the city planet, causing collateral damage along the way. Darth Sidious decided to remove his troubled apprentice from the galactic capital, and Vader chose Mustafar as his new seat of power. The fortress was designed by the spirit of an ancient Sith Lord named Momin, who built it with the intent of reaching the netherworld of the Force. Vader hoped to use its power to save Padme, and although he was successful in accessing the netherworld, he still failed to undo her death.
Director Krennic has arrived.
Who was Darth Vader's attendant? His name was Vinay, an Imperial inspector that was driven insane by the power of the dark side in Fortress Vader. He became the Sith Lord's servant and ultimately outlived his master. He survived the fall of the Empire and remained in Vader's castle for decades. Vinay tried and failed to resurrect his master and held on to hope that Vader would somehow return. He underwent some pretty intense surgeries to stay alive and continue the work until he found a new hope, Darth Vader's grandson, Kylo Ren. Following the Battle of Krayt, Kylo traveled to Fortress Vader where he met Vinay, and the Sith Lord's old attendant taught him about his grandfather's history on Tatooine, Naboo, and beyond.
I say we fight!
Why does Admiral Ratis look different from Admiral Akbar? It's simply because he and his white-skinned aides were from a different part of their homeworld, Mon Cala. It was reasoned that Admiral Akbar and other Mon Calamari with warmer skin tones were from the warmer parts of the planet, closer to the equator of the ocean world. The farther you got from the warmer climates and the closer you got to the two frigid poles of Mon Cala, the cooler a Mon Calamari's skin tone would become. Admiral Ratis specifically was from the northern city Nistolum, where he served as mayor until joining the rebellion.
A decision needed to be made.
What happened to General Draven after the events of Rogue One? He continued to fight with the Rebel Alliance for another year after the destruction of the first Death Star. Darth Vader and his fleet cornered the rebellion at the Mako Ta space docks. In order to escape, Leia Organa devised a desperate plan to assault the Super Star Destroyer Executor to steal codes that had disabled the Rebel fleet. The plan was barely successful, and Draven gave his life to stall Imperial forces, resulting in his death at the hands of Darth Vader himself.
Good luck, little sister.
Why does Baze call Jyn Little Sister? We don't really know, so I'll speculate on what little we do. The Rogue One novelization says, Baze spoke the words with warmth and gravity, as if the words were a Jedha custom or an honor of the Guardians of the Wills. Jyn didn't know. She didn't have to know. I'm gonna guess that they were simple words of connection for either the Guardians of the Wills or their affiliated group, the Disciples of the Wills. As religious organizations, it makes sense that they would refer to one another as brothers or sisters, and Baze may have simply wanted to communicate to Jyn that he believed her cause and her actions were in line with the Force, and it could show that he himself was starting to come back to his own faith.
Attention all flight personnel. Please report to your commanders immediately.
Why didn't Wedge Antilles go to Scarif along with the rest of Red Squadron? The real reason is because in A New Hope, he is clearly reacting to seeing the Death Star for the very first time with his line, "Look at the size of that thing," so it wouldn't make sense for him to see it in Rogue One. So the decision was made to leave Wedge out of the fight, but you can hear the voice of David Ankrum, who voiced the character in A New Hope, briefing flight crews over the intercom at the Rebel base. So Wedge is technically in the movie. Later materials have stated that Wedge was recovering from an injury and wasn't cleared to fly at Scarif. By the time of the Battle of Yavin, he had either recovered or the rebellion was desperate enough for pilots that he was allowed to fly. What's the difference between an AT-AT and an AT-ACT? One was made for war and one was not. The all-terrain armored transport was meant to deliver soldiers, speeder bikes, and other weapons of war all within a highly armored and armed walker. The all-terrain armored cargo transport was larger, but was less heavily armed and more vulnerable to attack. They were designed to offer some protection for the cargo they moved, and were certainly devastating against standard infantry, but were more easily brought down by Rebel ships than their smaller counterparts. That's why they've only ever been seen on already heavily guarded Imperial installations or construction projects. Where were U-Wings, TIE Strikers, Shore Troopers, TIE Reapers, and Death Troopers in the original Star Wars trilogy? They weren't created back then, so of course they wouldn't appear. Yeah, I know that's the real answer, but let's explore the in-universe answer, which is that they were always just off-screen. U-Wings were definitely around throughout the rest of the Galactic Civil War and can be seen at the Battle of Endor in the campaign for Battlefront 2. TIE Strikers were an experimental craft made primarily for atmospheric combat, and their specialization simply meant that they were a more rare sight. But they were also used throughout the rest of the Galactic Civil War, as seen in the Alphabet Squadron novels and the Battle of Jakku comics. Shore Troopers were trained for coastal combat, and we simply didn't see any other beach combat in the original trilogy. TIE Reapers were support ships and were used in the campaign for Star Wars Squadrons, which takes place after the Battle of Endor. Death Troopers were initially created to protect members of the Tarkin Initiative, and may have seen a decline in use after the death of Tarkin himself, but they were still around and were seen protecting other Imperial VIPs like Moff Gideon during the time of the Imperial Remnant.
Stellar Sphere, Mark Omega, Pax Aurora.
What are the other code names Jyn reads off on Scarif? We know Stardust is the Death Star, but Jyn also mentions Stellar Sphere, Mark Omega, Pax Aurora, War Mantle, Cluster Prism, and Black Saber. We only know for sure what one of those code names is referring to. Project War Mantle was detailed in the Bad Batch, and was the Empire's initiative to remove clone troopers in favor of Imperial volunteers and conscripts. War Mantle was used as a codename until it was publicly revealed to the Imperial Senate as the Stormtrooper Initiative. The other codenames have yet to be mentioned in any Star Wars story since Rogue One, so we can only speculate on their significance. For example, Black Saber could be a nod to the Star Wars Legends superweapon, the Darksaber, or it might refer to the Mandalorian Darksaber if the Empire had any specific plans for it. We simply don't know right now. What is this dangerous, random opening and closing vent Jyn has to climb through at the top of Scarif's Citadel Tower? From a story perspective, I think it's just another dangerous obstacle placed in her way to keep the tension high, but the Rogue One novelization by Alexander Freed tells us that it did indeed serve a purpose. The data vault was basically a giant server or computer system, and as such, it needed to be cooled. There was a series of vents that opened and shut in sequence, pulling out the warm air that rose to the top of the tower.
Prepare for impact!
Did the Hammerhead Cruiser crew survive? Some of them did. The Rogue One novelization by Alexander Freed goes into more detail, telling us Captain Cato Okwone had all essential personnel evacuate the cruiser in escape pods, leaving behind a skeleton crew of humans and droids. In theory, their maneuver could have been achieved through autopilot, but Cato knew their mission was too important for any mistakes. He stayed behind to go down with the ship along with some volunteers. The crew behind Rogue One have pointed out that the model for the Hammerhead Cruiser no longer had any escape pods on it when it was destroyed, presumably to give some hope of the crew's survival, but Freed decided that Captain Okwone and his pilots did not survive.
Rogue One, may the Force be with you.
Was Rogue Squadron named after Rogue One? Yes, that's a pretty easy assumption to make, but you can find that specific story in the 2015 run of the flagship Star Wars comic. In between A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, Luke learns about Jyn Erso and the rest of Rogue One and all the sacrifices that were made just to get him into a position to make that impossible shot during the Battle of Yavin. Shortly after, the Imperial fleet cornered nearly all of the Rebel Alliance where they gathered at the Mako Ta shipyards. Luke defied orders by throwing together a new squadron to defend his fleet, and so he named the new group Rogue Squadron. What happened to Admiral Ratis? The short and unfortunate answer is that he was captured and killed. The book Star Wars Timelines confirms that the Admiral was killed when the Profundity was destroyed above Scarif. I think Darth Vader likely returned to his Star Destroyer after the Tantive 4 escaped and opened fire on the Rebel flagship before giving chase to Princess Leia. The 2015 run of Star Wars comics was the first story to confirm Ratis' death, but his example helped spark hope of rebellion in the Mon Calamari people. His legacy would endure into the time of the New Republic, and the Resistance flagship was named after the fallen hero. Are those TIE bombers attacking the Profundity? Although they look like TIE bombers, they're actually TIE boarding craft. At a glance, the two ships were nearly identical, but boarding craft were slightly larger, and instead of carrying bombs, they carried passengers, 10 total. So this group of ships was simply delivering Darth Vader and 20 or so stormtroopers to the Rebel flagship in hopes of recapturing the Death Star plans. I'll also point out that there is another similar TIE variant called the TIE Shuttle, which was for VIPs and officers. You can briefly see one in The Empire Strikes Back taking Captain Needa from his Star Destroyer Avenger to the Executor. Why was the Tantive 4 docked inside the Profundity? According to the Rogue One novelization, it was in desperate need of repairs, so was docked inside of the Rebel flagship and remained there even when it jumped to join the Battle of Scarif. The Blockade Runner's crew worked frantically to fix a leak in its hyperdrive motivator, which they barely got working in time to make their escape. Unfortunately, the repairs were incomplete and allowed Darth Vader's Star Destroyer to track and chase the Tantive 4 to Tatooine, even without the use of the fancy hyperspace tracking technology the First Order would eventually use. What happened to the shots of Jyn and everyone running across the beach with the Death Star plans? Rogue One famously went through a lot of rewrites and reshoots. One of the major changes seems to be the simplification of the theft of the Death Star plans. It would appear that originally Jyn and company would steal the plans from one building and then make their way across the beach to a separate facility to transmit them to the Rebel fleet. Online, you can find footage of K2SO's original death as he falls alongside who appears to be an already dead Cassian Andor as they presumably try to hold off the Empire while Jyn transmits the data. That was all simplified into one building where the plans were both held and transmitted. I'll be surprised if this ever happens, but we're coming up on Rogue One's 10-year anniversary. I would love a tell-all version of the original story, including the many deleted sequences seen in the trailers. But that brings us to the end of the most frequently asked questions I've seen about Rogue One. If you liked this video, check out the ones I've already done answering questions for the original, prequel, and sequel trilogies. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on our socials, and consider checking out our Patreon page for even more Star Wars talk. As always, thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.